After continued talks through the night in the key UN climate summit in Peru, delegates have finally agreed upon a deal. The compromise sets the stage for a global climate pact in Paris next year. CCTV's Dan Collyns joins us from Lima with more details. Dan, it's been a long 2 weeks. How important is this deal?
Yes, Susan. This deal is very important because it sets the world on course for a much bigger agreement on climate change, which the United Nations hopes will be signed at the end of next year. Now, that deal, this draft text signed here in Lima, should set us on course for that. That deal will basically lay out how the world combats climate change over the next 3 to 4 decades. So it's, of course, extremely important. And now, after 2 weeks of negotiations here, negotiations that ran over by more than a day, as there were several sticking points on this deal. Finally, the text was agreed, and here's how it happened.
Running into extra time and under pressure to get a deal, Peru's Environment Minister Manuel Pugal Vidal presented a new 4th draft just before midnight. He gave parties just an hour to review it. The 2 previous texts had been rejected by developing countries who accused rich nations of shirking their responsibilities to fight global warming.
It
seems to me, and I am sure, that we are all ready to take on the challenge of approving this document. And if that is the case, and I don't hear any objection, the text is approved.
Approval. With negotiations on the brink of collapse after 2 weeks of talks, there was relief and celebrations.
Carefully reworded to overcome objections, the text is finally approved in the early hours of Sunday morning. The first step on the road to a global climate change deal in Paris next year.
The goal was to reach a draft agreement for countries' individual pledges to combat global warming. But even that proved difficult, as poorer countries demanded financial aid from richer ones to combat climate change. Finding compromise had been hard, said the UN's climate chief, Christiana Figueres.
We do know that we must address climate change. We know increasingly that we can address climate change. And with this COP and moving on to Paris, we cement the fact that we will address climate change.
But observers say the spirit of compromise led to a deal with no teeth.
So we came in here on a wave of optimism. We had these announcements from the US and China. We had lots of good announcements from countries in Latin America about renewable energy, about protecting forests. And where we are now is that we have a weak text, and we're going to have an incredibly hard road towards Paris if we want to get a good global deal.
As delegates head home, the work towards a global climate change deal in Paris is just beginning.
So, Susan, this will kick the ball down the road to Paris. There's still a tremendous amount of work to do on this document. As I mentioned, this is the 4th draft text. It's only 4 pages long, but it does address some very key concerns which were brought up during these negotiations. For the United States and the EU, they wanted upfront pledges from each nation on how it's going to cut carbon emissions. That's been included in this text. For China, China was worried about outside supervision of its carbon cuts. The wording has been subtly changed in this text, so China are also satisfied. And for small island nations and the nations most affected by climate change, it acknowledges loss and damage compensation, which means that they'll be able to get financial aid from richer countries for the impacts of climate change, like rising sea levels, which they're already suffering. It also levels out the difference between developed and developing nations, particularly emerging nations, which the developed world, particularly the United States, says that India, China, Brazil need to do more to move towards clean energy and move away from fossil fuels. So it has set out a more of a level playing field. It's clearly a compromised document. Not everybody is entirely happy, but it's quite an achievement nonetheless. Susan.
I would say so, Dan. I was just going to say it's not easy to get 2 countries on the same page, but 200. This is quite a task. Quickly tell us, how is it being viewed by critics?
Well, there have been critics, environmental NGOs particularly, have said that this is a weak text, and it almost would have been better to have no deal than a weak deal which won't deal with the impacts of climate change, which won't deal with what scientists predict will be a 2-degree rise in temperature by the end of the century. But on the other hand, disaster could have been averted according to other people. They say that no deal would have been a disaster, and it seems that disaster has been averted. Consensus, there's a political will of all nations to tackle climate change, and that in itself is an achievement.
Dan Collyns, thank you so much for reporting live from Lima. We appreciate it.